Close your eyes for a moment and imagine this. No adventure, no heroic music, no dramatic battles. Just cold air, stiff clothes, aching bones, and the same dull routine repeating every single day. Medieval life wasn't exciting, it wasn't romantic, it was painfully boring, slow, exhausting, and endlessly repetitive. And tonight, you're going to live inside that boredom. This is not a story about kings or knights. This is the quiet, uneventful, grinding reality of ordinary medieval people, where nothing happens, and that is exactly the point. Medieval life moved at a pace that would feel unbearable to us today. There were no notifications, no entertainment, no quick escapes from routine. Days were not filled with surprises, they were filled with waiting. Waiting for daylight, waiting for food, waiting for seasons to change. Most people lived their entire lives within a few miles of where they were born, doing the same tasks, seeing the same faces, hearing the same sounds, until old age or illness quietly ended it all. For the average medieval person, life was not a series of events, it was a long, slow stretch of sameness. Morning arrived without alarm clocks. You woke when the light crept through cracks in wooden walls or when animals stirred nearby. Beds were rough, often nothing more than straw stuffed into sacks. Sleep was shallow and broken, interrupted by cold air, insects, or aching joints. There was no sense of waking refreshed. You simply stopped lying down and started enduring the day. Clothing was stiff and uncomfortable. Most people owned only one or two outfits. These clothes were worn every day, repaired endlessly, and rarely washed. Fabric scratched the skin. Shoes were hard and unforgiving. Nothing fit particularly well. Comfort was not expected, so it was never missed. The first task of the day was survival. Food had to be secured, animals tended, tools prepared. Breakfast was dull and repetitive, coarse bread, thin porridge, maybe a small piece of cheese if you were lucky. Taste was secondary to availability. Meals were fuel, not pleasure. Work began immediately and continued for hours without variation. Farming dominated medieval life, even for those who lived in towns. Fields had to be plowed slowly by hand or with animals. The work was quiet, repetitive, and physically draining. Every movement was familiar. Every day felt like the one before. There was no concept of career progression or personal growth. You did the work you were born into. A farmer's child became a farmer. A blacksmith's child learned the same trade. Life was not about choice, it was about continuation. Time itself felt different. Without clocks, the day was measured by the sun's position and church bells. Hours blurred together. Waiting was constant. Waiting for crops to grow, waiting for tools to be repaired, waiting for illness to pass, waiting for winter to end. Patience was not a virtue, it was a necessity. Entertainment barely existed. There were no books for most people, no music on demand, no games beyond simple physical diversions. Stories were repeated endlessly. Songs were few and familiar. Even festivals, which were rare, followed the same patterns year after year. Nothing truly new happened. Travel was slow and exhausting, so most people never traveled at all. A journey of a few miles could take an entire day. Roads were muddy, uneven, and dangerous. Leaving your village meant discomfort, risk, and uncertainty. Staying put was safer, even if it meant endless monotony. Social life offered little escape. You saw the same people every day, often the same small group for your entire life. Conflicts lingered, gossip recycled endlessly. There was no way to disappear or reinvent yourself. Your reputation followed you everywhere. Even religion, which structured medieval life, added to the repetition. Prayers followed strict routines. Church services repeated the same words, the same rituals week after week.
Faith offered meaning, but it also reinforced routine and obedience. Illness did not disrupt boredom with drama, it simply added suffering. Minor injuries lingered, infections were common, pain was constant, dull, and accepted. Medical treatment was limited, slow, and often ineffective. Recovery, if it came, was gradual and eventless. Nights brought little relief. Darkness fell early. Candles were expensive, so activities stopped. People sat quietly or went to bed early, not because they were tired, but because there was nothing else to do. Silence filled the hours. Winter made boredom heavier. Cold confined people indoors. Food became scarcer. Days shortened. Work slowed but never stopped entirely. The same walls, the same sounds, the same waiting. Winter was not dramatic, it was endlessly dull. Years passed almost unnoticed. Without calendars or milestones, life blended together. There were no birthdays celebrated for most people. Age was guessed, not recorded. One season replaced another, until the body simply wore out. Death, when it came, was rarely sudden or heroic. It arrived quietly after long illness or exhaustion. Life ended much as it was lived, slowly. Medieval life was painfully boring because it lacked contrast. There were no highs to balance the lows, no excitement to break the rhythm, just a steady, grinding normality. Modern stories romanticize the medieval world with castles and battles, but those were rare interruptions in a sea of dull routine. Most people never saw a knight, never heard a battle, never left their village. Their lives were defined by repetition, silence, and waiting. And perhaps that is why medieval boredom feels so heavy to imagine. It was not empty time filled with choice, it was time filled with obligation, repeated endlessly. No escape, no distraction, just another day identical to the last. And tomorrow would be the same.
Imagine waking up and knowing with absolute certainty that nothing new will happen today. No surprise, no excitement, no change. Just the same cold floor under your feet, the same dull work waiting outside, and the same slow passage of time stretching endlessly ahead. This was medieval life. Not dramatic, not adventurous, but painfully boring in a way modern minds can barely tolerate. Tonight, there are no heroes, only routine, only repetition, only the quiet weight of another identical day. Medieval boredom was not caused by laziness or lack of imagination. It was built into the structure of life itself. Everything moved slowly, predictably, and without variation. The world did not rush, it waited. Most medieval people lived in small villages surrounded by fields. These villages rarely changed. Buildings stayed the same for generations. Roads remained muddy and uneven. New structures were rare and unremarkable. If you left your village and returned years later, you would find almost nothing different. The day began with light, not choice. When the sun rose, so did you. There was no sleeping in, no personal schedule. Your body followed daylight whether it wanted to or not. Mornings were cold, especially in winter. Breath hung in the air. Fingers felt stiff before work even began. Homes were simple and uncomfortable. Walls were thin. Roofs leaked. Smoke from cooking fires lingered inside, irritating eyes and lungs. Furniture was minimal. A bench, a table, maybe a chest. Space was shared with animals in many homes. Privacy did not exist. Food was monotonous. Bread dominated every meal. Thick, coarse, and often stale, it filled the stomach but offered little pleasure.
Porridge was common, made from whatever grain was available. Meat was rare for ordinary people, saved for special occasions. Most days tasted exactly the same. Cooking itself was slow and repetitive. Fires took time to start. Pots were heavy. Recipes did not change. Meals were prepared the same way, day after day, year after year. There was no experimentation. Hunger, not curiosity, dictated eating. Work filled nearly every waking hour. Fields required constant attention. Weeding, planting, harvesting. Each task followed the seasons with little variation. Tools were basic and heavy. Progress was slow. A full day's labor often produced very little visible result. There was no sense of efficiency. Everything took longer than it should. A task that might take minutes today could take hours. Repairs were frequent. Tools broke easily. Waiting was part of work. Children joined labor early. There was no extended childhood. By the time a child was physically able, they were contributing. Their days mirrored adult days almost exactly. Learning meant repetition, not creativity. Education was rare and limited. Most people never learned to read or write. Knowledge was practical and narrow. You knew what your parents knew and little more. Curiosity had few outlets. Time passed slowly because nothing marked it. There were no calendars hanging on walls. Years blended together. People remembered time by events: a harsh winter, a bad harvest, a local dispute. If nothing memorable happened, time simply disappeared. Church bells structured life, but they also reinforced routine. Prayer times, services, holy days, all repeated endlessly. The words spoken were the same each time. Comfort came from familiarity, not excitement. Festivals offered brief breaks, but even these were predictable. Same songs, the same food, the same rituals. They were moments of noise in an otherwise quiet year. Once over, life returned immediately to normal. Travel was rare and unpleasant. Roads were unsafe. Bandits, illness, weather, all made travel risky. For most people, the world extended only as far as they could walk and return in a day. Everything beyond that was irrelevant. News traveled slowly. Events in distant places might be heard months or years later, if at all. Even dramatic happenings elsewhere barely affected daily life. Your world was small and unchanging. Clothing reinforced boredom. Colors were dull. Styles changed slowly, if at all. Clothes were repaired constantly, patched until fabric nearly disappeared. Dressing each day felt the same. Hygiene was minimal. Bathing was rare. Water had to be carried. Soap was scarce. Dirt became part of the body. Smells were constant and familiar. Discomfort faded into the background. Illness blended into daily life. People worked while sick. Pain was ignored until it became impossible. Without effective medicine, recovery was slow and uncertain. Suffering was quiet and ordinary. Nightfall ended activity quickly. Darkness was absolute. Candles were expensive. People sat quietly or slept. Conversation slowed. Silence dominated evenings. There was no nightlife, no distraction. Winter deepened monotony. Cold limited movement. Days shortened. Food ran low. Everyone waited for spring, counting time not by days, but by endurance. Aging was subtle and unnoticed. Without mirrors or records, people aged without ceremony. One day you were strong enough to work, later you were not. Life adjusted without comment. Death did not disrupt routine for long. Burials were simple. Work resumed quickly. Life continued for the living, unchanged. Medieval life was boring because it allowed no escape from itself. There was no alternative lifestyle to imagine, no future to plan, no past to revisit with nostalgia, only the present, repeating endlessly. Modern minds crave stimulation, but medieval people survived on endurance. Their boredom was not dramatic, it was quiet, heavy, and constant. Every day felt long, every year felt the same, and tomorrow promised nothing different.
Medieval life was defined by slowness. Not the peaceful slowness people seek today, but a heavy, unavoidable slowness that filled every hour. Time did not rush forward, it dragged. Days felt long, seasons felt endless, and years blended together without clear distinction. For ordinary medieval people, life was not a sequence of memorable moments. It was a continuous stretch of routine that rarely changed. Most people were born, lived, and died in the same small area. Their world was narrow, both physically and mentally. Villages remained almost identical for generations. Houses were repaired, not replaced. Paths were worn down slowly by footsteps and carts, not redesigned or improved. Change was rare and slow enough that it barely registered. Daily life followed the sun. When daylight appeared, work began. When darkness arrived, work stopped. This rhythm never varied. There were no clocks to divide time into neat sections. Hours were not counted precisely. Instead, people experienced time as a long flow of effort and waiting. Homes offered little comfort or distraction. Most houses were small, dark, and smoky. Fireplaces filled rooms with soot. Windows were tiny or non-existent. Light was limited, and shadows dominated interiors. Furniture was minimal and functional. There was nothing decorative to draw the eye or stimulate the mind. Sleeping arrangements were uncomfortable. Beds were shared. Mattresses were filled with straw or rough material that shifted and flattened over time. Sleep was often interrupted by cold, noise, or insects. Rest was incomplete, but there was no alternative. Food was repetitive and uninspiring. Bread formed the foundation of nearly every meal. It was dense, coarse, and often stale. Porridge was common, made from simple grains. Vegetables were limited to what could be grown locally. Meat was rare and usually tough. Meals existed to prevent starvation, not to provide enjoyment. Cooking required patience. Fires took time to build. Ingredients were basic and unchanging. The same meals were prepared the same way day after day. There was no sense of novelty in eating. Hunger was satisfied, but interest was not. Work consumed most of life. Farming required constant labor, regardless of weather or physical condition. Fields needed tending, animals needed care, tools needed maintenance. Each task was repeated endlessly. Progress was slow, and results were often uncertain. Craftsmen and laborers experienced similar monotony. A blacksmith shaped the same objects repeatedly. A weaver produced the same patterns. A laborer lifted and carried the same materials. Skill improved, but variety did not. Children were absorbed into this routine early. Childhood was brief and practical. Learning meant copying adults, repeating movements until they became automatic. There was little room for play or imagination. Education was limited to the privileged few. Most people never learned to read or write.
Knowledge was passed orally and remained narrow. New ideas traveled slowly, if they traveled at all. Social life offered no real escape. Villages were small, and people interacted with the same individuals daily. Conflicts lingered. Familiarity bred predictability. There was no anonymity and no chance to reinvent oneself. Religion structured time and reinforced repetition. Prayers followed fixed schedules. Services repeated the same words and rituals. Holy days returned every year without variation. Faith provided meaning, but also reinforced routine. Festivals were brief interruptions rather than true changes. They followed familiar patterns and ended quickly. Once over, work resumed immediately. The rhythm of life remained intact. Travel was slow, uncomfortable, and dangerous. Roads were poor. Journeys took days or weeks. Most people avoided travel unless necessary. Their understanding of the world remained limited to nearby areas. News traveled slowly and often arrived distorted or incomplete. Events beyond the local area had little impact on daily life. Large historical moments passed unnoticed by most. Hygiene standards were low. Bathing was infrequent due to limited water access and cultural norms. Dirt and odor became normal. Discomfort was accepted as part of existence. Illness was common and persistent. Minor injuries could become serious. Medical knowledge was limited, and treatment was slow. People continued working while sick because survival demanded it. Pain was not dramatic. It was dull, constant, and familiar. Bodies wore down gradually under repeated strain. Aging was not celebrated or marked. It simply happened. Even evenings offered little relief. Darkness limited activity. Candles were costly and used sparingly. People sat quietly, spoke softly, or slept. Silence dominated nights. Winter intensified boredom. Cold restricted movement. Food supplies dwindled. Days shortened. People waited for spring without certainty that it would improve. Years passed without clear milestones. Birthdays were rarely noted. Time was measured by harvests and hardships. Life felt like a continuous present rather than a progression. Death arrived quietly and often. Burials were simple. Grief was real but brief because survival required continued effort. Life resumed almost immediately. Medieval life was boring because it offered no alternatives. There were no choices about lifestyle, occupation, or pace. People endured rather than explored. The absence of stimulation shaped the medieval mind. Patience was forced. Endurance was valued. Expectations were low. From a modern perspective, this lack of variation feels unbearable. Yet for medieval people, it was normal. They did not compare their lives to others. They accepted repetition as reality. Life continued in this way for generations, unchanged and unremarkable. Days blended into months, months into years, years into lifetimes. Nothing dramatic happened most of the time. And that was medieval life.
Medieval life unfolded slowly, without urgency and without variety. For most people, existence followed a narrow path that was set long before they were born. There were few surprises and almost no changes. Life was shaped by habit, repetition, and endurance, rather than excitement or discovery. The medieval world was quiet in ways that feel unfamiliar today. There were no engines, no constant background noise, no artificial light filling the night. Sounds were limited to footsteps, wind, animals, and human voices. Long stretches of silence were normal, especially in rural areas. Silence did not feel peaceful. It felt empty
and heavy. People woke with the sun because there was no alternative. Darkness ended activity completely. Morning arrived gradually, not suddenly. Cold air lingered inside homes. Bodies felt stiff after nights spent on rough bedding. There was no sense of comfort or restfulness. Sleep simply ended, and work began. Homes were built for survival, not enjoyment. Walls were rough and uneven. Roofs leaked during rain. Smoke from indoor fires filled rooms and clung to clothes and hair. Windows were small or covered with animal skin or cloth. Light was dim, even during the day. Furniture was scarce and purely functional. A bench, a table, perhaps a chest for storage. There were no decorations meant to please the eye. Nothing existed purely for beauty. Everything had a purpose, and that purpose was usually work. Personal possessions were few. Most people owned very little beyond tools, clothing, and basic household items. Objects were repaired repeatedly until they could no longer be used. New items were rare and often costly. Familiarity surrounded every aspect of life. Clothing was uncomfortable and repetitive. Most people owned one main outfit, sometimes two. Clothes were worn daily, patched often, and washed infrequently. Fabric was coarse. Shoes were stiff and poorly fitted. Dressing each morning felt exactly the same as the day before. Food defined the rhythm of survival. Bread was central to nearly every meal. It was dense, rough, and filling. Porridge was common, prepared from grains that varied little year to year. Vegetables were limited to what could be grown locally. Flavor was unimportant compared to availability. Meals were not events. They were pauses between work. Cooking took time, but it followed the same steps every day. Fires burned slowly. Pots simmered quietly. There was no experimentation or creativity. Eating was predictable and dull. Work dominated waking hours. Farming was the foundation of medieval life. Fields demanded constant attention through planting, tending, and harvesting. The work was physical, repetitive, and exhausting. Progress was slow, and results depended heavily on weather. Other professions offered little relief from monotony. A blacksmith shaped the same tools repeatedly. A carpenter cut and joined wood in familiar patterns. A weaver produced the same fabrics over and over. Skill improved, but routine never changed. Children joined this cycle early. Childhood was brief and practical. Learning meant observing and copying adults. There was little time for play or exploration. From a young age, children understood that their future would resemble their present. Education was rare. Most people never learned to read or write. Knowledge passed orally and remained limited to immediate needs. Curiosity had little room to grow. New ideas traveled slowly and rarely reached ordinary people. Time passed without clear structure. Without clocks, days blurred together. People measured time by natural signs: sunrise, sunset, seasons, and church bells. Hours were felt rather than counted. Religion shaped daily routine. Prayer times marked the day. Church services repeated the same rituals and words. Holy days returned each year without variation. Faith offered meaning, but also reinforced repetition and obedience. Festivals provided brief interruptions. They were predictable and short-lived. The same celebrations occurred at the same times each year. Once finished, Life returned immediately to its normal pace. Social life offered little novelty. Villages were small. People interacted with the same neighbors throughout their lives. Familiar faces became unavoidable. Conflicts lingered because there was no escape from them. Travel was slow, uncomfortable, and risky. Roads were poor. Journeys took days or weeks. Most people rarely traveled beyond nearby areas. The wider world remained distant and abstract. News traveled slowly. Events elsewhere often arrived months or years later, if at all. Even major historical moments passed unnoticed by most people. Daily life remained unchanged. Hygiene standards were basic. Bathing was infrequent due to limited water access and cultural habits. Dirt and odor became normal. Discomfort faded into the background of daily life. Illness was common and persistent. Minor injuries could become serious. Medical knowledge was limited, and treatment was slow. People continued working while sick because survival required it. Pain was not dramatic, it was constant and familiar. Bodies wore down gradually under repeated strain. Aging happened quietly, without recognition or ceremony. Evenings brought little change. Darkness limited activity. Candles were expensive and used sparingly. People sat quietly, talked softly, or slept. Silence filled the night. Winter intensified boredom. Cold restricted movement. Food supplies dwindled. Days shortened. People waited for spring without certainty or optimism. Survival replaced hope. Years passed with few markers. Birthdays were rarely noted. Life events blended together. Time felt like a continuous present rather than a journey. Death arrived often and quietly. Funerals were simple. Grief was real but brief. Life continued because it had to. Medieval life was boring because it offered no alternatives. There were no choices about pace, profession, or lifestyle. People endured rather than explored. From a modern perspective, this lack of stimulation feels unbearable. Yet, for medieval people, it was normal. They did not expect excitement. They expected continuity. Life moved forward slowly, quietly, and predictably. Days repeated themselves. Seasons returned unchanged. Generations lived and died without leaving much behind. Nothing dramatic happened most of the time. And that quiet sameness defined medieval life.
Medieval life was not shaped by excitement or ambition. It was shaped by necessity. For most people, each day existed only to support the next. Life moved forward slowly, without milestones, without sudden change, and without variety. The absence of stimulation was not temporary, it was permanent. The medieval world felt small. Villages were isolated, surrounded by fields, forests, or marshland. Roads were narrow and poorly maintained. Travel was rare and exhausting, so most people stayed close to home their entire lives. The same landscape, the same buildings, and the same faces surrounded them from birth until death. Morning began when light appeared. There was no decision involved. Darkness made work impossible, so daylight dictated routine. People rose from sleep not because they felt rested, but because there was nothing else to do. Beds were simple and uncomfortable, often shared. Sleep was light and frequently interrupted. Homes offered little relief from the outside world. Walls were thin and uneven. Cold air entered easily in winter.
Heat escaped quickly. Smoke from cooking fires lingered indoors, coating surfaces and lungs alike. Light was limited, and shadows dominated interior spaces. Most houses contained very few objects. Furniture was basic and functional. Decoration was rare. Personal possessions were minimal and often worn down from years of use. Everything felt familiar because nothing changed. Clothing reflected this sameness. Most people owned one main set of clothes. These garments were worn every day, repaired repeatedly, and washed infrequently. Fabric was coarse and uncomfortable. Colors were dull and faded. Getting dressed each morning felt identical to the day before. Food defined survival, but offered no excitement. Bread was central to nearly every meal. It was dense, rough, and filling. Porridge appeared regularly, made from simple grains. Vegetables depended on local availability and season. Meat was rare for ordinary people. Meals were not social events or pleasures. They were functional pauses between work. Cooking followed the same steps every day. Fires burned slowly. Pots simmered quietly. There was no sense of anticipation or enjoyment. Work consumed most waking hours. Farming required constant effort. Fields needed tending throughout the year. Animals required daily care. Tools required maintenance. The work was repetitive, physical, and often exhausting. Other professions offered similar monotony. Craftsmen repeated the same actions endlessly. A blacksmith shaped familiar tools. A weaver produced the same fabrics. Skill developed, but routine never changed. Children entered this cycle early. Childhood was short and practical. Learning meant copying adults and repeating tasks until they became automatic. Imagination had little place in daily life. Education was limited. Most people never learned to read or write. Knowledge was passed orally and remained narrow. New ideas traveled slowly and rarely reached ordinary villagers. Time felt long and indistinct. Without clocks, days blurred together. People measured time by natural signs and religious routines. Weeks and months passed without clear markers. Religion structured life, but reinforced repetition. Prayers followed strict schedules. Church services repeated the same words and rituals. Holy days returned each year without change. Festivals provided brief breaks, but they followed predictable patterns. The same celebrations occurred at the same times each year. Once finished, work resumed immediately. Social life offered little escape. Villages were small. People interacted with the same neighbors daily. Familiarity replaced novelty. Conflicts lingered because there was no way to avoid them. Travel was slow and uncomfortable. Roads were unsafe and poorly maintained. Journeys required significant effort and risk. Most people rarely traveled beyond nearby areas. News traveled slowly. Events elsewhere often arrived late or distorted. Even major historical moments passed unnoticed by most people. Hygiene was basic. Bathing was infrequent. Water had to be carried. Soap was scarce. Dirt and odor became normal parts of life. Illness was common and persistent. Minor injuries could become serious. Medical knowledge was limited, and treatment was slow. People worked through sickness whenever possible. Pain became ordinary. Bodies wore down gradually under repeated strain. Aging occurred quietly, without recognition or ceremony. Evenings brought little change. Darkness limited activity. Candles were expensive and used sparingly. People sat quietly or slept. Silence filled the night. Winter intensified monotony. Cold restricted movement. Food supplies dwindled. Days shortened. People waited for spring without certainty or optimism. Years passed with few milestones. Birthdays were rarely noted. Time was remembered by hardships rather than achievements. Death was frequent and unremarkable. Funerals were simple. Life resumed quickly for the living. Medieval life was boring because it allowed no alternative paths. There were no choices about pace, profession, or environment. People endured rather than explored. From a modern perspective, this constant repetition feels unbearable. Yet for medieval people, it was expected. They did not anticipate excitement. They anticipated continuity. Life continued quietly, slowly, and predictably. Days repeated themselves. Seasons returned unchanged. Generations lived similar lives. Nothing dramatic happened most of the time. And that steady sameness defined medieval existence.
Medieval life passed without urgency, without acceleration, and without surprise. For ordinary people, existence was shaped by repetition so complete that days became almost indistinguishable from one another. Life was not measured by moments of excitement, but by endurance. Time moved forward slowly, quietly, and without interruption. The medieval environment itself encouraged boredom. Villages were small and isolated, surrounded by farmland or wilderness. Roads were poor and difficult to travel. Most people rarely ventured far from home. The same scenery greeted them every morning and evening. Change was so rare that it often went unnoticed. Morning began with light, not intention. When the sun rose, people rose. There was no concept of choosing how to start the day. Sleep ended abruptly, often without comfort. Beds were simple, shared, and uncomfortable. Rest was shallow, and waking felt no different from the night before. Homes provided shelter, but little comfort. Walls were uneven and drafty. Roofs leaked during heavy rain. Smoke from fires filled interior spaces, irritating eyes and lungs. Light was dim even during the day, making rooms feel heavy and enclosed. Furniture was scarce and purely functional. Most homes contained only what was necessary for daily survival. There were no objects meant solely for enjoyment or decoration. Everything served a purpose, and that purpose rarely changed. Personal belongings were limited. Clothing, tools, and a few household items made up most possessions. Items were repaired repeatedly rather than replaced. Familiarity surrounded people constantly. Clothing reinforced monotony. Most individuals owned a single main outfit. These clothes were worn daily, patched often, and washed infrequently. Fabric was coarse and uncomfortable. Colors were dull and faded. Dressing each morning required no thought because nothing varied. Food followed the same pattern. Bread dominated meals, dense and filling but rarely fresh. Porridge appeared regularly, prepared from simple grains. Vegetables depended on season and local soil. Meat was uncommon for ordinary people. Taste mattered little compared to survival. Meals were quiet and uneventful.
They were pauses between labor rather than moments of enjoyment. Cooking followed identical steps each day. Fires burned slowly, pots simmered without urgency. Nothing about eating broke the rhythm of routine. Work occupied nearly all waking hours. Farming required constant attention throughout the year. Fields needed planting, tending, and harvesting. Animals required daily care. Tools required maintenance. The work was physical, repetitive, and often exhausting. Other trades offered little variation. Craftsmen repeated the same actions endlessly. A blacksmith shaped familiar tools. A carpenter cut and joined wood in predictable ways. Skill improved, but daily experience remained unchanged. Children were absorbed into this rhythm early. Childhood was short and practical. Learning meant imitation and repetition. By a young age, children understood that their future would closely resemble their present. Education was limited to a small minority. Most people never learned to read or write. Knowledge remained practical and narrow. New ideas spread slowly and rarely reached rural communities. Time itself felt heavy. Without clocks, hours blurred together. People measured time by daylight, seasons, and religious routines. Days stretched long, especially during repetitive labor. Religion structured daily life. Prayers marked the passage of time. Church services followed fixed rituals and repeated the same words week after week. Holy days returned each year without variation. Faith offered meaning but reinforced predictability. Festivals provided brief interruptions, but even these followed familiar patterns. The same songs, foods, and rituals appeared each year. Once finished, normal life resumed immediately. Social life offered little escape from boredom. Villages were small, and people interacted with the same individuals every day. Familiarity replaced novelty. Conflicts lingered because avoidance was impossible. Travel was slow, uncomfortable, and risky. Roads were poorly maintained. Journeys required significant effort and time. Most people rarely traveled beyond nearby settlements. News traveled slowly. Events in distant places often arrived late or not at all. Even major historical developments had little effect on daily routines. Hygiene standards were basic. Bathing was infrequent due to limited water access and cultural habits. Dirt and odor became normal parts of life. Discomfort faded into the background. Illness was common and persistent. Minor injuries could become serious. Medical knowledge was limited, and treatments were slow and often ineffective. People worked through sickness whenever possible. Pain became familiar rather than alarming. Bodies wore down gradually under constant strain. Aging occurred quietly, without recognition or celebration. Evenings brought little relief. Darkness limited activity. Candles were expensive and used sparingly. People sat quietly, spoke softly, or slept. Silence filled the night. Winter intensified boredom. Cold restricted movement. Food supplies dwindled. Days shortened. People waited for spring without certainty or optimism. Years passed with few milestones. Birthdays were rarely noted. Life events blended together. Time was remembered by hardships rather than achievements. Death was common and unremarkable. Funerals were simple. Work resumed quickly. Life continued because survival demanded it. Medieval life was boring because it offered no alternative paths. There were no choices about pace, profession, or environment. People endured rather than explored. From a modern perspective, This endless repetition feels unbearable. Yet for medieval people, it was normal. They expected routine, not excitement. Life moved forward quietly and predictably. Days repeated themselves, seasons returned unchanged. Generations lived similar lives. Nothing dramatic happened most of the time, and that quiet repetition defined medieval existence.
Medieval life was shaped by slowness so complete that it became invisible to those living it. Days passed without urgency, without interruption, and without novelty. For ordinary people, life was not something to be experienced or explored. It was something to be endured, quietly and repeatedly, until it ended. The medieval world was limited in scale. Villages were small and isolated, separated by forests, fields, rivers, and poorly maintained roads. Most people never traveled far from where they were born. Their entire lives unfolded within the same narrow landscape. The same paths were walked daily. The same buildings stood unchanged for decades. Each morning began in the same way. Light slowly replaced darkness, filtering into homes through cracks, small windows, or open doors. People woke not because they felt rested, but because daylight made work possible. There was no sense of choice. The day began whether one was ready or not. Sleep offered little relief. Beds were rough and uncomfortable, often shared by several people. Mattresses were filled with straw or other coarse materials that flattened quickly. Cold air entered easily in winter, while insects disturbed rest in warmer months. Sleep was shallow and easily broken. Homes provided shelter but little comfort. Walls were uneven and poorly insulated. Roofs leaked during rain. Smoke from indoor fires lingered constantly, filling rooms with haze and odor. Light was dim even during the day, making interiors feel heavy and enclosed. Furniture was minimal and purely functional: a bench, a table, perhaps a chest. There were no objects meant for decoration or enjoyment. Everything existed to serve a practical purpose, and that purpose rarely changed. Personal belongings were few. Most people owned only what they needed to survive. Clothing, tools, and a small number of household items made up nearly all possessions. Items were repaired repeatedly rather than replaced. Familiarity surrounded every aspect of life. Clothing reinforced monotony. Most individuals owned one main outfit, sometimes supplemented by a second garment for colder weather. Clothes were worn every day, patched often, and washed infrequently. Fabric was coarse and uncomfortable. Colors were muted and faded. Dressing each morning required no thought because nothing varied. Food followed an equally repetitive pattern. Bread was central to almost every meal. It was dense, rough, and filling, but rarely fresh. Porridge occurred regularly, made from simple grains. Vegetables depended entirely on local soil and season. Meat was rare for ordinary people. Meals were not social events filled with conversation and enjoyment. They were quiet, functional pauses between labor. Cooking followed the same steps every day. Fires burned slowly, pots simmered without urgency. There was no anticipation or pleasure associated with eating. Work dominated nearly every waking hour. Farming was the foundation of medieval life. Fields required constant attention throughout the year. Planting, weeding, harvesting, and maintenance filled the seasons. Animals needed daily care regardless of weather or illness. The work was physically demanding and endlessly repetitive. Progress was slow. Results depended heavily on weather,
which could not be controlled. A full day of labor often produced little visible change. Other professions offered no real escape from monotony. Craftsmen repeated the same actions endlessly. A blacksmith shaped familiar tools day after day. A weaver produced the same patterns repeatedly. Skill improved, but variety never appeared. Children were drawn into this routine early. Childhood was short and practical. Learning meant observation and imitation. From a young age, children understood that their future would closely resemble their present. Education was rare and limited. Most people never learned to read or write. Knowledge was passed orally and remained focused on immediate survival. New ideas traveled slowly and often failed to reach rural communities. Time itself felt long and heavy. Without clocks, hours blended together. People measured time by daylight, seasons, and religious routines. Days stretched endlessly during repetitive labor. Religion structured daily life and reinforced routine. Prayers marked the passage of time. Church services repeated the same words and rituals week after week. Holy days returned each year without variation. Faith offered meaning, but it also reinforced predictability. Festivals provided brief interruptions, but even these were familiar. The same celebrations occurred at the same times each year. Songs, foods, and rituals changed little. Once finished, normal life resumed immediately. Social life offered little novelty. Villages were small, and people interacted with the same neighbors throughout their lives. Familiarity replaced excitement. Conflicts lingered because avoidance was impossible. Travel was slow, uncomfortable, and risky. Roads were poorly maintained. Journeys required significant effort and time. Most people avoided travel unless absolutely necessary. News traveled slowly and often incompletely. Events in distant places arrived late, if at all. Even major historical developments rarely affected daily routines. Hygiene standards were basic. Bathing was infrequent due to limited water access and cultural habits. Dirt and odor became normal. Discomfort faded into the background of daily existence. Illness was common and persistent. Minor injuries could become serious. Medical knowledge was limited, and treatments were slow and often ineffective. People worked through sickness whenever possible. Pain became familiar rather than alarming. Bodies wore down gradually under constant strain. Aging occurred quietly, without recognition or celebration. Evenings brought little change. Darkness limited activity. Candles were expensive and used sparingly. People sat quietly, spoke softly, or slept. Silence dominated the night. Winter deepened monotony. Cold restricted movement. Food supplies dwindled. Days shortened. People waited for spring without certainty or optimism. Years passed with few milestones. Birthdays were rarely noted. Life events blended together. Time was remembered by hardships rather than achievements. Death was common and unremarkable. Funerals were simple. Grief was real but brief. Work resumed quickly because survival demanded it. Medieval life was boring because it offered no alternatives. There were no choices about pace, profession, or environment. People endured rather than explored. From a modern perspective, this endless repetition feels unbearable. Yet, for medieval people, it was normal. They expected routine, not excitement. Life continued quietly and predictably. Days repeated themselves, seasons returned unchanged, generations lived similar lives. Nothing dramatic happened most of the time, and that unbroken sameness defined medieval existence. Medieval life was built on repetition so deep that it erased any sense of novelty. For most people, each day followed the same narrow path as the day before. There were no sudden changes, no unexpected opportunities, and no meaningful choices. Life moved slowly, quietly, and predictably from beginning to end. The medieval landscape itself encouraged monotony. Villagers were small clusters of houses surrounded by fields and forests. Roads were narrow, muddy, and difficult to travel. Because travel was exhausting and dangerous, most people remained close to home for their entire lives. The same view greeted them every morning and every evening. Days began with daylight. When the sun rose, work began. There were no alarms, no schedules to adjust, and no personal preferences to consider. Sleep ended not because it was complete, but because darkness had passed. Beds were rough, often shared, and rarely comfortable. Rest was shallow and inconsistent. Homes provided shelter but little comfort. Walls were uneven and poorly insulated. Cold air entered easily in winter, while heat built up in summer. Smoke from cooking fires filled rooms, leaving a constant haze and smell. Light was limited, making interiors dim and uninviting. Furniture was minimal and functional. A table, a bench, perhaps a storage chest. There were no decorations meant to please the eye or distract the mind. Every object existed for a practical reason, and that reason rarely changed. Personal possessions were few and familiar. Clothing, tools, and basic household items made up nearly everything a person owned. Items were repaired repeatedly rather than replaced. Nothing felt new. Clothing reflected this sameness. Most people owned one primary outfit. Clothes were worn daily, patched often, and washed infrequently. Fabric was coarse and uncomfortable. Colors were dull and faded. Dressing each morning required no decision or thought. Food followed an unchanging pattern. Bread was the foundation of nearly every meal. It was dense, filling, and often stale. Porridge appeared regularly, made from simple grains. Vegetables depended entirely on local conditions and season. Meat was rare for ordinary people. Meals were quiet and functional. They were moments to restore energy, not occasions for enjoyment. Cooking followed identical steps each day. Fires burned slowly. Pots simmered without urgency. There was no anticipation associated with eating. Work consumed almost every waking hour. Farming dominated medieval life. Fields required constant attention through planting, tending, and harvesting. Animals needed daily care, regardless of weather or illness. The work was physically demanding and endlessly repetitive. Progress was slow and often invisible. A full day of labor might result in little visible change. Effort was constant, but reward was uncertain. Other professions offered little variation. Craftsmen repeated the same actions endlessly. A blacksmith shaped familiar tools day after day. A weaver produced the same patterns repeatedly. Skill increased, but experience remained unchanged. Children entered this routine early. Childhood was short and practical. Learning meant watching adults and copying their actions. From a young age, children understood that their future would look very much like their present. Education was limited to a small minority. Most people never learned to read or write. Knowledge remained narrow and focused on survival. New ideas spread slowly and rarely reached ordinary villagers. Time felt long and heavy. Without clocks, hours blended together. People measured time by daylight, seasons, and religious observances. Days stretched endlessly during repetitive labor. Religion structured daily life. Prayers marked the passage of time. Church services repeated the same rituals and words week after week. Holy days returned each year without variation. Faith offered meaning, but reinforced predictability. Festivals provided brief interruptions. They followed familiar patterns and ended quickly. Once finished, life returned immediately to its normal rhythm. Social life offered little novelty. Villages were small, and people interacted with the same neighbors throughout their lives. Familiarity replaced excitement. Conflicts lingered because avoidance was impossible. Travel was slow, uncomfortable, and risky. Roads were poorly maintained. Journeys required significant effort and time. Most people avoided travel unless absolutely necessary. News traveled slowly. Events in distant places arrived late or not at all. Even major historical changes rarely affected daily routines. Hygiene standards were basic. Bathing was infrequent due to limited water access and cultural habits. Dirt and odor became normal. Discomfort faded into the background of daily existence. Illness was common and persistent. Minor injuries could become serious. Medical knowledge was limited, and treatments were slow and often ineffective. People worked through sickness whenever possible. Pain became familiar rather than alarming. Bodies wore down gradually under constant strain. Aging occurred quietly, without recognition or ceremony. Evenings brought little relief. Darkness limited activity. Candles were expensive and used sparingly. People sat quietly, spoke softly, or slept. Silence dominated the night. Winter deepened monotony. Cold restricted movement. Food supplies dwindled. Days shortened. People waited for spring without certainty or optimism. Years passed with few milestones. Birthdays were rarely noted. Life events blended together. Time was remembered by hardships rather than achievements. Death was common and unremarkable. Funerals were simple. Work resumed quickly. Life continued because survival demanded it. Medieval life was boring because it offered no alternatives. There were no choices about pace, profession, or environment. People endured rather than explored. From a modern perspective, this endless repetition feels unbearable. Yet for medieval people, it was expected. Routine was life. Days repeated, seasons returned, generations lived and died in similar ways. Nothing dramatic happened most of the time, and that quiet repetition defined medieval existence.